Millionaire Richard Sterling, owner of the luxurious Grandview Hotel overlooking Central Park, stared out at the breathtaking Manhattan skyline. But his mind wasn't on the view. It was fixed on expansion. He needed more space for his ever-growing empire, and there was just one annoying obstacle: a small, dilapidated orchard stubbornly clinging to its land right next to his property line. Mark, his ever-efficient assistant, hurried in, placing a file on Richard's mahogany desk. "Mr. Sterling," she refused again. Richard spun around, his voice sharp as ice. "Again? Sarah Jenkins still doesn't want to sell." "No, sir. Says no amount of money would change her mind." Mark sighed. "That woman just doesn't understand what she's doing. We've offered her enough to buy a penthouse overlooking the park," Richard exclaimed, frustration lacing his tone. "It seems she's deeply attached to the place. Family memories, you know," Mark explained. "And then there's her little sister, Lily, who has a serious respiratory condition. She adores that orchard. The fresh air is good for her." "If money doesn't work," Richard said, a cold glint in his eyes, "we'll try something else." "Another approach, sir?" Mark asked cautiously. Richard grabbed his tailored jacket, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'll handle this personally." Days later, a dusty pickup truck rattled down the long, unpaved driveway leading to the Jenkins orchard in the Hudson Valley. Richard, trading his power suit for worn jeans, a faded blue shirt, and work boots, felt almost unrecognizable. Richard Sterling, the ruthless tycoon, was gone. In his place was just Richard Miller, a guy looking for a break from city life. Sarah Jenkins looked up as the truck approached, her brow furrowed. She was perched on the porch steps of a charming but slightly weathered farmhouse, a basket overflowing with freshly picked apples beside her. Sweat glistened on her forehead, and strands of blonde hair escaped her messy bun. Beside her, Lily, a small girl with wide hazel eyes and a tangle of brown hair, was engrossed in a worn storybook. "Who's that?" Lily whispered, looking up from her book. "I don't know," Sarah replied, standing and wiping her hands on her worn denim apron. The truck stopped, and the man stepped out, flashing a disarmingly friendly smile. He looked out of place, yet somehow not threatening. "Hello," he greeted, raising a hand in a casual wave. "Sorry to just show up unannounced. I'm Richard Miller. I'm traveling through the area." He scratched his head, feigning awkwardness. "And, well, I'm looking for a place to stay for a few days, get away from the city." Sarah's frown deepened. "This isn't a bed and breakfast." "I know," Richard said, his smile widening slightly. "But I heard this place is special. I was thinking maybe I could help out in exchange for a place to sleep, do some work around the orchard." She crossed her arms, eyeing him up and down. "And what does a city man know about working an orchard?" Richard chuckled, as if expecting the question. "More than you'd think. I actually grew up on a farm, believe it or not. I can prune trees, harvest fruit, fix fences, even handle animals. I just need a quiet spot for a few days." Sarah remained hesitant, but Lily, her curiosity piqued, stepped closer to the edge of the porch. "Can you really fix fences? Ours is broken out back," she piped up. Richard smiled, nodding, turning his gaze back to Sarah. "Let me prove it. If I'm not useful, I'll be gone tomorrow." Sarah hesitated. She'd learned not to trust strangers, especially charming ones, but the workload on the orchard was overwhelming and any help would be a godsend. "All right," she finally conceded, her voice still laced with caution. "But you'll stay in the old cabin by the barn. Don't expect any luxury." Richard grinned, relief washing over him. "Deal." By late afternoon, Richard was in the orchard, sweat pouring down his face as he hammered relentlessly at the broken fence. He nailed the last plank into place, the satisfying thud echoing in the quiet afternoon air. Looking up, he saw Sarah watching him from a distance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I warned you it wouldn't be easy," she remarked, walking closer. Richard wiped his forehead with his sleeve, managing a tired smile. "It's a start. Maybe I'm not as useless as you thought." She didn't reply, but a faint, involuntary smile flickered at the corner of her lips. Lily ran over, holding a small wicker basket with 2 bright red apples. "Here, Richard," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. "You earned a reward." Richard took an apple, thanking her and Lily. "Thanks, Lily. I needed this." He bit into it, savoring the sweet, crisp flavor. As he chewed, he glanced around at the rows of trees, the simple farmhouse, the sky turning shades of orange as the sun began to set. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar, something akin to peace, a missing piece he hadn't even realized he was searching for. As night fell, Richard sat alone in the small cabin by the barn. Inside, the cabin was Spartan. A wooden bed, a rough-hewn table, a flickering lantern casting long shadows. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with a message from Mark. "Any progress?" Richard stared at the words for a long moment before replying simply, "I'm working on it." He turned off his phone, the city's demands fading into the quiet rustle of leaves and the chirping of crickets. For the first time in a long while, he was far from luxury, from corporate meetings, from the relentless pressure of his world. And for some reason, he felt less empty. Still, one question lingered in the back of his mind. How long before Sarah discovered the truth? The game, he knew, was only just beginning. The first hint of dawn was painting the sky a soft pink when Sarah was awakened by the distant sound of hammering. For a moment, she thought it was a dream, but when the sound persisted, she threw on her worn jacket over her pajamas and hurried out to the barn. There he was, Richard Miller, kneeling beside the fence he'd worked on the day before, hammering a new board with focused determination. He looked strangely at ease, as though this kind of work was second nature. Tools were scattered around him, tools she hadn't even realized were missing. Sarah crossed her arms, watching him for a moment before approaching. "You're not wasting any time, are you?" she said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. Richard looked up, startled, but quickly smiled. "Good morning to you, too. I thought getting an early start might improve my chances of impressing the boss." "Boss?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in her eyes. "That's news to me." "Of course, you're the owner here," Richard said, delivering a final, decisive strike to the nail before standing. "Another section of fence, good as new." Sarah glanced at his work. He clearly knew what he was doing. The repair was solid, well done, something she hadn't expected from a city slicker. Even so, she kept her expression stern. "That doesn't mean you've earned a permanent place here," she said, turning back towards the farmhouse. "Breakfast is almost ready. If you want to eat, wash your hands." "Yes, ma'am," Richard replied with an amused smile as Sarah walked away. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Lily sat at the old wooden table, coloring a picture while Sarah finished scrambling eggs. "Sarah, is Richard going to stay here for a long time?" Lily asked, her eyes still fixed on her drawing. Sarah hesitated before answering. "I don't know, Lily. He said he just wants to help. We'll see if he can handle it." Lily smiled, a rare, sunshine-bright smile that warmed Sarah's heart. "I like him. He seems nice." Sarah didn't respond, focusing instead on the eggs, her mind swirling with her sister's words. Ever since their parents had passed, Lily rarely trusted strangers. The fact that she seemed to already like Richard, it was something Sarah couldn't ignore. When Richard entered the kitchen, his hands clean, his hair still a bit tousled, Lily was the first to greet him. "Good morning, Richard. I made a drawing for you." "For me?" Richard leaned down, accepting the paper which showed a smiling sun above a simple house. "Wow, Lily, you've got talent. I'll keep this with me." Sarah glanced over her shoulder as she served breakfast. "Food's ready. If you plan to keep working, you'll need to eat something." "Thank you, Sarah," Richard said, taking a slice of bread. "This bread looks amazing. Did you make it?" "Who else would have?" she replied, not quite smiling. Lily giggled softly. Richard noticed Sarah wasn't the type to open up easily. Her gaze remained watchful, as if waiting for him to slip up. Richard spent the morning helping Sarah with the endless tasks she'd been putting off for days. He organized the cluttered tool shed, fixed a squeaky wheel on the wheelbarrow, and pulled weeds from the overgrown vegetable garden. "Where did you learn all this?" Sarah asked suddenly as they worked side by side under the midday sun. "Like I said, I grew up on a farm," Richard replied, not looking up from the soil. "My dad always said you only understand the value of things when you put your hands to work." Wise words," Sarah murmured. She didn't press further, but her curiosity was palpable. Richard rarely spoke about himself, and when he did, his answers seemed carefully rehearsed. Despite that, he was efficient, hardworking, and didn't complain about the endless chores. Across the orchard, Lily played with wildflowers she'd picked, running back and forth, her laughter echoing in the gentle breeze. For a few seconds, Richard stopped working and watched the little girl, a soft smile playing on his lips. "She looks happy," he observed quietly. Sarah followed his gaze, a soft smile briefly escaping before she quickly masked it. "Lily loves this place. Our parents built it all from scratch, you know. Every tree, every fence, they gave us a home. Now, it's my responsibility to take care of it." Richard felt a pang in his chest. For a moment, he almost forgot why he was really there. "Must be hard, doing it all on your own," he said, his voice low. Sarah took a deep breath, wiping her hands on her apron. "I manage. I always have." She turned and walked towards the barn, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He knew he needed to stay focused on his mission, but with each passing moment on the orchard, the carefully crafted plan seemed harder and harder to follow. Night had fallen, and the sky was ablaze with stars, a breathtaking spectacle Richard hadn't seen in years. He was sitting on the cabin steps when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Lily holding a small, hand-stitched blanket. "Are you cold, Richard?" he asked. "No, I brought this for you," Lily said, handing him the blanket. "Sarah says the nights here can get chilly." She sat down beside him on the steps, her small legs dangling. "Thank you, Lily. You're very thoughtful." The little girl looked up at the stars, a faint smile gracing her face. "My mom used to say that every star is a dream, and when you look at them, you can make a wish." Richard gazed at the vast, star-studded sky. "And what would you wish for, Lily?" "That Sarah never has to worry about anything. Ever again," she answered instantly, her voice filled with innocent conviction. Richard's heart ached. He glanced at the simple cabin, then at the farmhouse further away, where Sarah was probably already asleep, carrying the weight of the world on her young shoulders. A heavy silence settled between them. "What about you, Richard?" Lily asked, her eyes wide and curious. "What would you wish for?" Richard didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he truly wanted. That night, lying on the creaky mattress in the cabin, Richard stared up at the wooden ceiling. Lily's voice echoed in his mind, along with images of the orchard, of Sarah's reserved smile, of Lily's unwavering spirit. He knew he was getting more involved than he should be, and that was dangerous. On the other side of the orchard, Sarah was still awake too. Lying in bed next to Lily, she found herself thinking about Richard Miller, the mysterious city man who had appeared out of nowhere. Despite her inherent distrust, she couldn't deny that Richard had brought something new to the orchard, a flicker of something that felt like hope. But a voice in her mind kept screaming, "Who is he, really? Why is he here?" Sarah Jenkins was determined to find out what Richard Miller was hiding. The day began under a heavy, overcast sky, the wind whistling through the trees around the orchard. Richard woke with a sense that this day would be different, though he couldn't quite explain why. Stepping out of the cabin, he saw Sarah stacking logs beside the barn. She paused, resting a hand on her knee, and cast him a quick, assessing glance. "I thought you'd sleep in today, miss your chance to impress the boss," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Not a chance," Richard chuckled softly. Sarah didn't reply, but the corners of her mouth turned up slightly. Richard walked over and began stacking logs without being asked. "You don't have to do that," Sarah muttered, though her tone lacked real protest. "I don't have to, but I want to," Richard replied simply. They worked side by side in comfortable silence for a few minutes until Sarah finally spoke. "I was thinking about heading into town today. I need to pick up some medicine for Lily and a few new tools." Richard stopped what he was doing, looking at her. "Mind if I come with you?" Sarah glanced at him, slightly surprised. "That's not necessary. It's just an hour's drive." "I know, but I'm trying to be useful. Besides, I can help carry everything." Sarah hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Fine. But don't think that gives you the right to pick the music on the radio." Richard grinned. "Deal." The drive to town was peaceful. The bumpy dirt road eventually gave way to a smooth highway. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the road while Richard watched the passing scenery. Sprawling green fields, patches of woods, and small, quaint houses scattered here and there. It was such a stark contrast to his life in the city, where everything was meticulously planned and perfectly controlled. "How's Lily doing?" Richard asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "She has good days and bad days," Sarah replied, her focus still on the road. "The problem is, the medicine is expensive, and so are the doctor visits." Richard noticed the subtle tension in her voice. "You handle all of this by yourself?" "Yes," Sarah answered quickly, as if wanting to end the conversation. Richard didn't push further, but her words resonated deeply. He already knew Sarah was strong, but every day he discovered just how much weight she carried. When they reached town, Sarah parked the truck in front of a small independent pharmacy. Richard got out with her and, without being asked, helped carry the heavy bags filled with Lily's medication and other essentials. "You really didn't have to come," Sarah said as she organized everything in the back of the truck. "I know," he said, meeting her gaze, "but there's nowhere else I'd rather be." Sarah stared at him for a moment, taken aback by his response. The sincerity in his voice was disarming. She turned away, a blush warming her cheeks, and slammed the tailgate shut. "We need to stop by the hardware store next." Richard just nodded, smiling. On the way back to the orchard, the overcast sky darkened further. The wind picked up and light raindrops began to patter against the truck's windshield. "Looks like a storm's coming," Richard commented. "Yeah," Sarah sighed. "It's going to be a rough night." The sound of the rain intensified, and by the time they arrived back at the orchard, it was pouring. Sarah quickly got out, carrying the bags inside, Richard following close behind. "Lily!" Sarah called, placing the medicine on the kitchen table. "Are you okay?" "I'm here." Lily's voice came from the living room. She was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the rain lash against the window panes. "Looks like the storm is here to stay," Richard remarked, glancing out at the downpour. Sarah sighed, taking off her wet jacket. "I'll light the wood stove. If the storm gets worse, we might lose power." Richard watched as Sarah moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency. He had never met anyone so independent, so resilient. "Need any help?" he asked. "You can help Lily set the table," she replied, not looking at him. Richard went to the living room where Lily smiled at him, still clutching her blanket. "Richard, will you tell us a story tonight?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Sarah always tells me stories on stormy nights, but I already know all of hers." Richard chuckled softly, sitting down on the couch beside her. "All right, I'll think of a good one to tell, but only if you promise to finish all your dinner." "I promise," Lily said eagerly. Hours later, the storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee, but inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere was warm and cozy. The wood stove radiated heat, and Sarah had prepared a simple but delicious soup. After dinner, they gathered in the living room. Lily nestled between Richard and Sarah on the couch. "So what story are you going to tell us?" Lily asked, looking at Richard expectantly. Richard thought for a moment before beginning. "When I was a child, my father used to tell me about a traveler searching for something he didn't even know he had lost. He walked through bustling cities, crossed raging rivers, climbed towering mountains, but he never found what he was looking for." Lily listened intently, her wide eyes filled with wonder. Until one day, he arrived at a small, simple place, where the people treated him like family. For the first time, he felt at peace. He realized he didn't need great treasures or glittering cities. Everything he had been searching for had always been right there, a home. When Richard finished the story, a comfortable silence settled over the room. Lily smiled, snuggling deeper into her blanket. "I liked that story," she said softly. Sarah, who had been silent the whole time, looked at Richard with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "It's just a story," he said almost defensively. "Maybe," Sarah replied gently, before standing up. "Come on, Lily, time for bed." Lily protested, but obeyed, saying goodnight to Richard before heading upstairs. Richard remained alone in the living room for a few moments, listening to the rain drumming against the windows. When Sarah returned, she paused in the doorway, watching him. "Thanks for helping today. Lily really enjoyed the story." "She's an incredible kid," Richard said, glancing at the staircase where Lily had disappeared. "And you're incredible too, you know." Sarah looked surprised, and for a second, she didn't know how to respond. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean you," Richard said, meeting her gaze. "What you do for Lily, the way you take care of this place. Not just anyone could do that." She looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I just do what needs to be done." "Not everyone would," Richard insisted. Sarah didn't reply, simply nodding before turning towards the kitchen. "Good night, Richard." "Good night, Sarah." When she disappeared down the hallway, Richard let out a long sigh, running his hands through his hair. He knew he was losing his way. Every moment he spent here, every one of Lily's smiles, every glance from Sarah pulled him further from his original plan. Outside, the storm raged, as if mirroring the turmoil within him. The lie he had built was becoming too heavy, and Richard Sterling knew time was running out. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the storm had never happened. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air fresh and crisp, and the sound of birdsong filled the orchard. Life on the Jenkins orchard seemed to return to its usual rhythm, but something between Richard and Sarah had shifted. The comfortable silence they had shared now felt heavier, strained, as if both were avoiding acknowledging the unspoken connection growing between them. Richard was in the barn, organizing the last of the tools, when he heard light footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Lily with a small basket in her hands. "Sarah asked me to bring this to you. They're new seeds for planting." Richard smiled, taking the basket. "Thanks, Lily. I'll take them to her right now." He gently patted the top of her head and walked across the orchard, the simple beauty of the place striking him anew. More and more, he felt like he belonged here, a feeling that both warmed and scared him. Sarah was kneeling among the rows of young apple trees, her face flushed, strands of hair sticking to her forehead. When Richard arrived, she looked up, offering him a faint smile. "Working hard?" he asked, setting the basket down beside her. "Always," Sarah replied, grabbing a handful of seeds and scattering them into the freshly turned soil. "There's no rest here." Richard crouched beside her, taking a handful of seeds as well. "Let me help." She glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, as if she wanted to say something but held back. His presence already felt like a part of her daily routine, even though she didn't want to admit she liked it. "I didn't know millionaires knew how to plant," she said, a hint of teasing in her voice. Richard froze for a split second, but quickly masked it with a smile. "What was that?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "I'm kidding," Sarah said, laughing, a genuine, bright laugh that made Richard's heart skip a beat. "Your hands are too callous to be a city man." She paused, her gaze becoming more serious. "I just don't understand what you're really doing here, Richard." He swallowed hard. That question was becoming harder and harder to answer. "Maybe," he said, his voice softer now, "maybe I need a place like this just as much as you do." She paused, looking into his eyes, searching for something. There was something in his expression that made her believe him, even if only for a fleeting moment. Later that afternoon, Sarah left to visit a neighboring farm to sort out an issue with a supplier. Richard was left in charge of taking care of Lily and handling the lighter chores around the orchard. "Want to feed the chickens?" Richard suggested to Lily. "Let's do it," Lily replied enthusiastically. They spent the afternoon laughing and playing. Despite her fragile health, Lily ran around the yard with an infectious energy that made Richard smile. She reminded him of a time long forgotten, a time when the world was simpler, and small things brought true joy. He remembered the story he had told them, about the traveler searching for home. He realized with a jolt that maybe he was as that traveler. When Richard and Lily returned to the porch, she ran inside to grab her coloring book, leaving him alone. Richard used the moment to look around, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. But then something caught his eye. On a small table by the door was a pile of mail and documents. Among them, an envelope stamped with the Sterling Hotel's logo. Richard froze, his heart racing. Why were those papers here? He stepped closer and picked up the envelope, recognizing it immediately. It was one of the offer contracts his team had sent to Sarah weeks ago. Before he could process what to do, he heard footsteps behind him. Sarah was standing in the doorway, holding a shopping bag, her face pale as she noticed what he was holding. "What are you doing?" Her voice was sharp, incredulous. Richard turned quickly, dropping the envelope as if it had burned his hands. "Sarah, I can explain." "Explain what?" She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing, filling with suspicion. "What is a document from Sterling Hotels doing in my house?" Richard took a deep breath, scrambling for the right words, but every second of silence only made things worse. I wanted to tell you earlier, but... Sarah stepped back as if he were a dangerous stranger. "No, this can't be..." Her voice trembled, disbelief and pain warring in her eyes. You work for them?" Richard lowered his head for a moment, the weight of his deception crushing him. He couldn't hide the truth any longer. When he looked up again, his expression was filled with pain and regret. "Sarah, I am them. My name isn't Richard Miller. I'm Richard Sterling." Time seemed to stop. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock, as if she'd been physically struck. "No," she whispered, taking another step back. "You're joking. All this time, you've been lying?" "At first, yes," Richard admitted, his voice barely audible. "I came here because I needed to convince you to sell the orchard. I thought, if I got to know you, I could make you change your mind." "Convince me?" She spat the word with disgust. "You lied. Deceived me, came into my home, pretended to be someone you're not." "I know, and I'm so sorry," Richard pleaded, taking a step closer. But Sarah raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Don't touch me." Her voice was now trembling with raw anger. "Do you think this is some kind of game? That you can use my sister, my home, my memories, as pieces on your chessboard?" "It's not like that, Sarah," Richard desperately tried to explain. "Please, listen to me. What started as a plan, it changed. I changed." "Changed?" Sarah laughed bitterly, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're a liar, a manipulator." "I don't want the orchard anymore," Richard said, his voice thick with desperation. "I don't want to take anything from you." "And I don't want to hear your voice anymore," Sarah said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Get out of my house. Now." "Sarah..." Richard stood there for a moment, unable to believe the swiftness of her rejection. He looked at her, searching for a trace of forgiveness, but all he saw was pain, betrayal, and a profound sense of hurt. Finally, he stepped back, the fight draining out of him. "I'll leave," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "But I never wanted to hurt you." Sarah didn't reply. She just stood there, unmoving, watching as he walked to the cabin, gathered his few meager belongings, and left. Lily, who had quietly come downstairs, saw everything from afar, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, why is he leaving?" Lily asked, her small voice choked with sadness. Sarah turned slowly, wiping her face quickly. "He never should have been here, Lily." Lily looked out the window, watching as Richard Sterling, disappeared down the long driveway, and her young heart ached with a pain she couldn't understand. Hours later, the farmhouse was silent, heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, her face buried in her hands. She felt a tangled mess of emotions: anger, pain, betrayal, but also a hollow emptiness she couldn't ignore. A part of her, deep down, still wanted to believe that Richard Miller had been sincere, that something real had grown between them. But how could she? Everything had been built on a foundation of lies. Across town, Richard drove back to the Grandview Hotel, his face somber, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had achieved everything he'd ever wanted in life: success, power, money, but for the first time, he felt like the poorest man in the world. Night fell over the glittering lights of the city, over the luxurious Grandview Hotel, but for Richard Sterling, there was no rest. Sitting in his expansive penthouse office, he stared out at the panoramic view, the city lights twinkling like a million distant stars. It was ironic. Everything he had built, what he had always believed was his greatest achievement, now felt meaningless, hollow. In the center of his massive desk, a stack of contracts awaited his signature, documents that would launch the hotel's ambitious expansion, swallowing up Sarah Jenkins's orchard in the process. He had gotten what he wanted. Everything was within his grasp. So why did he feel so utterly empty? "Mr. Sterling, the investors are waiting," Mark's voice broke through his bleak thoughts. "Tell them I'm on my way," Richard replied, his voice hoarse and distant. Mark hesitated. He had worked with his boss for years, but he had never seen him like this. The man who was always so confident, so decisive, now looked lost, adrift, as if carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "Sir, is everything all right?" Mark asked cautiously. Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the contracts on the desk, but in his mind, he could still hear Sarah's voice, sharp with pain. "You lied, deceived me, invaded my home, pretended to be someone you're not." Finally, Richard stood up, picked up the stack of contracts, and walked towards the opulent conference room where the investors were waiting. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Men in expensive suits chatted animatedly about the hotel's future, about profits and projections. On the massive presentation screen, the detailed map of the new luxury wing was displayed, including the area that would soon no longer be Jenkins' orchard. "Richard!" One of the most influential investors, Mr. Hayes, greeted him with a firm handshake. "We're eager to hear your final words. This is a golden opportunity." Richard forced a smile, took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. "Thank you all for being here. Let's get straight to it." The presentations began. Graphs, numbers, projections, all painting a rosy picture of future success. Richard listened in silence, his mind far away, back in the quiet orchard. He remembered Lily running through the rows of apple trees, her laughter echoing in the breeze. He thought of Sarah kneeling in the fields, scattering seeds with a quiet determination. He thought of a stormy night and a small farmhouse kitchen, warmed by the simple presence of a family he never expected to find. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stood. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him, expectant. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, but with a tremor of something new, something uncertain. "This project represents years of planning and a tremendous opportunity for all of us. The expansion will take the Grandview Hotel to new heights." He paused, looking at the eager faces of the investors. The words were right there, on the tip of his tongue. All he had to do was say what they wanted to hear, sign the contracts, and seal the deal. But instead he said, "But I've decided to cancel the expansion." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Mr. Hayes stood up immediately, his face incredulous. "What is this? A joke, Richard?" "No," Richard replied, his voice gaining strength. "Conviction. It's the right decision." "The right decision?" Mr. Hayes shot back angrily. "You're about to throw away millions over some whim?" It's not a whim, Richard said, meeting his gaze directly. There are things money can't buy. The protests continued, louder now, angrier, but Richard didn't waver. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something right, something that truly mattered. He gathered the contracts from the table, the weight of them suddenly feeling insignificant, and tore them in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. The meeting is over. Mr. Hayes glared at him, his anger palpable. You'll regret this, Richard. Richard didn't reply. He simply turned and left the room, his heart pounding, his head held high. Hours later, Richard drove along the familiar dirt road leading to Jenkins' orchard. The night sky was dark, starless, as if reflecting the storm within him. His heart pounded harder with every mile, every turn that brought him closer to the place that had somehow become his sanctuary. When he arrived, the dim light glowing in the farmhouse windows suggested Sarah was still awake. Richard stepped out of his car and stood for a moment, staring at the simple farmhouse that meant so much to her, to Lily. Taking a deep breath, he walked to the front door and knocked. After a few agonizing seconds, the door creaked open. Sarah stood there, silhouetted against the warm light from within. When she saw him, her expression immediately hardened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold, distant. "I need to talk to you, Sarah," Richard said softly, his voice pleading. "You've already said enough. Leave." "Sarah, please, just hear me out." He could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Eventually, with a sigh, she opened the door just enough to let him inside. Richard stepped into the living room, the small space where he had spent so much time with Sarah and Lily, sharing stories, laughter, quiet evenings by the fire. Now, however, the room felt cold, lifeless, devoid of warmth. "Speak," Sarah said, crossing her arms, keeping a safe distance. Richard looked into her eyes, and for a moment, he saw the depth of the pain he had caused. "I canceled the expansion," he said, his voice low, earnest. Sarah blinked, surprised. "What? The hotel project?" "I canceled it," Richard repeated firmly. "Your orchard is safe, Sarah. I won't bother you anymore." She studied him, her gaze intense, searching, trying to discern if this was just another elaborate lie. "Why?" she asked, her tone still laced with suspicion. "Because you were right," Richard said, taking a deep breath. "I came here with a plan. I lied. But after getting to know you, after seeing everything you do for Lily, for this place, I realized that what I was trying to destroy is worth more than any amount of money." Sarah didn't say anything, her expression unreadable. She just stared at him, trying to process his words, to reconcile the ruthless businessman she knew he was with the man standing before her now, his eyes filled with genuine remorse. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Richard continued, his voice softer now. "I just wanted you to know that I've given it up. This place, it's yours. It always has been." Sarah looked away, her heart pounding against her ribs. "And what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now? I leave," Richard replied, a sad smile touching his lips. "But before I go, I need you to know you've changed my life, Sarah. You showed me something I had lost a long time ago." He turned and walked towards the door, but before stepping out into the darkness, he heard her voice. "Richard?" He stopped, turning slowly back to face her. "Why did you do it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you really give it up?" Richard looked at her, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with a sincerity that finally broke through the walls Sarah had built around her heart. "Because I finally understood," he said, "that some things are worth protecting. And you taught me that." Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, watching as he walked out the door and disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with the weight of his confession and the first fragile tendrils of hope beginning to bloom in her weary heart.